Most kidnappings end one of two ways. The kidnappers get caught, or the victim doesn't come home. The 1983 abduction of Freddy Heineken ended a third way. Heineken came home. The kidnappers got caught. They served about 5 years, and 40 years later, around 8 million guilders of his ransom is still gone. The men who took it built one of the most violent criminal empires in modern European history, and the architecture that let them keep the money is still on the books in The Hague. So I want to be honest with you about what this video is. It's not a recap of the kidnapping. It's an argument. The argument is that the Heineken kidnappers won. Not in the sense that they avoided prison. They didn't. One of them is doing life right now in the same prison wing as the boss of the macro mafia. The argument is that they won the parts of the game that actually matter. The money, the law that should have taken the money back, and the country that decided to let them keep it. The structural reason this happened is a Dutch legal doctrine called the speciality principle, layered over an 1895 extradition treaty that didn't list kidnapping as a crime. We'll get there. But before any of that, you have to understand why a 23-year-old kid from a working-class neighborhood in Amsterdam thought he had the right to take Freddy Heineken in the first place. And that part doesn't start with the kid. It starts with his father. The Jordaan in the 1960s was a tight, narrow-streeted neighborhood in central Amsterdam, working class, loud, Catholic, in a city that mostly wasn't. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, including the business that no one wanted known. Inside one of those small apartments lived Wim Holleeder Sr., his wife, and their 4 children, Astrid, Sonia, Willem, Gerard. Wim Sr. worked at Heineken. Specifically, he transported the giant glass beer mug mock-ups the brewery used for promotion. He was also, by every account from inside the family, a violent alcoholic who beat his wife, terrorized his children, and could not hold a routine. The Heineken brewery eventually fired him for drinking on the job. This is the detail most retellings skip. The man whose son would one day take Freddy Heineken at gunpoint had spent his life working for Heineken and had been fired by Heineken. The boss who fired him is the same man whose disappearance 2 decades later would change the Netherlands forever. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole engine of the story. Astrid Holleeder, Willem's younger sister, has spoken about this for years. Their father simultaneously idolized Mr. Heineken and resented him. The kidnapping was about money. It was always also about something else. Into this house in the late 60s walked a kid named Cor van Hout. He was Sonia's age, more or less. He hung around the local pinball arcades, where he picked up the nickname Flipper. He started dating Sonia. He became Willem's best friend. By the late 70s, these two, Cor and Wim, were an inseparable pair. They robbed banks together. They committed armed robberies on armored cars. They were small time. They wanted to be big time. Around 1981, they started planning something that would make them big time forever. I keep coming back to the timeline of the planning because nothing about this kidnapping was improvised. 2 years. They considered Wisse Dekker, who ran Philips. They considered Albert Heijn, the supermarket Heir. They considered Anton Driesman from the V&D department store family. According to later police testimony from a man named Thomas van der Bijl, they even briefly considered Prince Bernhard. They settled on Freddy Heineken for 2 reasons. The official reason was liquidity. Heineken was a publicly traded company, and the family controlled it personally. They could move enormous sums of cash quickly without consulting boards or trustees. The unofficial reason, the reason no one in the gang said out loud, was that one of them had been waiting for this since he was a boy. To build what they were planning to build, they needed money. So in 1983, they robbed banks. They robbed armored trucks. They needed roughly 100,000 guilders to construct the cells, which is more than 300,000 euros in today's money. They got it the only way they knew how. What they built was inside a Quonset hut. If you don't know the term, a Quonset hut is one of those long, semi-cylindrical, corrugated metal prefabs you see in old wartime photographs. This one sat in an industrial estate called De Heining in Westport, the Western Harbor and Warehouse District of Amsterdam. The hut was on the grounds of a wooden carpentry company called Jadu Sawmills, which was owned by one of the kidnappers, a man named Jan Bellard. The carpentry company kept operating during normal business hours. Workers came in, workers went home. They never noticed anything strange. What they didn't notice was that the inside of the hut was about 4 meters shorter than the outside. The kidnappers had built a false wall at one end with a hidden door, and behind the false wall they had poured 2 concrete cells, soundproof, unheated, unlit, damp. Each cell had a thin mattress and a chemical toilet. Each cell had an iron ring set into the wall with a chain. The chain was for the prisoner's left hand. The plan was originally to grab Heineken at his villa in Noordwijk on the coast. They watched him for months. His routine never produced him at a predictable time. So, with about a week to go, they switched plans. They would grab him at the only place his presence was guaranteed, Heineken's corporate headquarters at the Tweed wettering plant Zoen in central Amsterdam. There's an irony here so novelistic it almost feels invented. On the morning of November 9th, 1983, Freddy Heineken hosted a luncheon at the brewery. The guests were police officers. He was thanking them for foiling an unrelated extortion attempt against the company a few weeks earlier. He toasted them. They toasted him. He went back to his office. At 6:56 that evening, he walked out the front of the brewery toward his waiting limousine. His chauffeur, a man named Doderer, was at the wheel. An orange panel van, stolen 4 months earlier in July, pulled up at speed. 3 hooded men jumped out with handguns drawn. They grabbed Heineken. They beat Doderer when he tried to defend his employer. Both men were handcuffed, hooded, with motorcycle helmets that had their visors taped over, and thrown into the back of the van. A taxi driver saw the struggle and started following. The kidnappers had planned for this. They drove the van about a kilometer, abandoned it with the engine still running near a bicycle tunnel, and transferred to a second vehicle. They left things behind on purpose: broken eyeglasses, motorcycle helmets, and according to some accounts, a bag of submachine guns to make the police think this was a paramilitary group or a foreign terrorist cell. It worked for about 48 hours. One detail that often gets lost: Doderer wasn't supposed to be there. The original plan was to take Heineken alone. Doderer was taken because Willem, Holleeder, personally knew him. Heineken's chauffeur and the kidnapper's son had met before, and Holleeder couldn't risk being recognized even through a hood. So the chauffeur came too. In the warehouse, both men were chained by the left hand to the cell wall. They were given 4 slices of bread in the morning and a hot meal in the evening. There was no spoken communication, only handwritten notes passed under the door by a hooded guard. For the first 4 days, neither prisoner knew the other was even in the building. Heineken's own account of those 21 days, given to United Press International on December 2nd, 1983, 2 days after his rescue, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things I've ever read from a kidnapping survivor. He said, "As far as the chain permitted, I tidied up my cell, and every morning I made my bed. Trying to establish a rhythm gives you something to do." He said he always saves 1 slice of bread in the morning, just in case there was no bread the next day. I keep coming back to that detail. A man chained to a wall in a soundproof concrete cell, and his survival strategy is to save bread for tomorrow morning. That tells you something about Heineken that the kidnappers never understood. He treated the kidnapping the way he treated everything else, as a logistical problem to be managed. You may have heard the famous quote attributed to him about his captivity, the one where he says they tortured him by playing Frank Sinatra records. I want to be honest with you. I went looking for the original source. I went through the United Press, international transcripts. I went through the Associated Press wires. I went through Peter de Vries's 1987 book, which is the canonical Dutch journalistic account of the case. The Sinatra line isn't in any of them. What is documented is that Heineken complained about the pop music his guards played and asked them to put on classical music, specifically Schubert. The Sinatra story may be folklore, possibly because Heineken was friends with Sinatra in real life. Treat it that way until something concrete surfaces. Now we get the ransom. This is where the story turns from a kidnapping into something larger. The demand was 35 million Dutch guilders. At the time, that was the largest ransom ever paid for a single individual, roughly 11 million United States dollars in 1983 money, adjusted for inflation, somewhere between 35 and 40 million dollars in today's purchasing power. The kidnappers were specific about the format: 4 currencies, Dutch guilders, American dollars, German marks, and French francs. Small denominations, no 1,000 guilder notes, no sequential serial numbers. The total came to roughly 200,000 individual banknotes packed into 5 large post bag style sacks. The sacks weighed approximately 400 kilograms in total, 881 pounds of paper currency. The drop happened on the night of November 28th into the early morning of the 29th. An unarmed lone driver, described in period reporting as a police volunteer, drove a white van marked with red crosses for roughly 240 kilometers across the Netherlands. He followed instructions left for him in plastic cups at successive stops. The final stop was a viaduct near Utrecht. The bridge had no on-ramps and no off-ramps anywhere near the drop point. The 5 sacks of cash were dropped through a drainage gutter built into the road surface, down to the kidnappers waiting in the dark below. Now, if you've ever worked in any kind of surveillance or operations, you already see the problem. The whole operation depended on the police being able to track the kidnappers from above as they drove away with the cash. This is the moment that almost nobody tells you about, and it's the single most important moment in the recovery of the money. The Dutch police didn't have their own night vision tracking camera. They had to rent one. They mounted it on a helicopter on a gyroscopic stabilizer, the kind that keeps the lens pointed at a moving target while the helicopter banks. The gyroscope failed in flight. The camera locked, staring at the empty landscape. On the audio recordings from inside the helicopter that night, you can hear the crew cursing as the kidnappers' vehicle drove off into pitch darkness, completely untracked, untraceable, gone. Former Justice Minister Frits Korthal's Altes confirmed this in his 2017 memoir. A broken night vision camera is the reason the Dutch state never recovered most of the money. The kidnappers drove to a wooded area near Zeist, where they had pre-buried plastic barrels. They loaded the cash into the barrels. They reburied them. They went home to wait. 40 hours passed. No release. No follow-up communication. The Heineken family was preparing to go public, demanding answers. And then 2 things happened almost simultaneously. An anonymous tip from a contractor's secretary in Amsterdam pointed police toward a property associated with Cor van Hout. And surveillance officers noticed a man buying 2 Chinese takeaway meals and carrying them into an industrial Quonset hut in Westport. Before I tell you what was recovered and what wasn't, I want to know what you would have guessed. Out of 35 million guilders dropped through a drainage gutter to men who had just driven away from a broken police camera, how much do you think the Dutch state ever got back? Tell me your guess. We'll come back to it. On the morning of November 30th, 1983, a tactical team of around 70 officers raided the Quonset hut at Jadu Sawmills. UPI reported that they took the building without firing a shot. The first sweep found the hut empty. An officer noticed a lock on a wall that shouldn't have had a lock. He forced it. The false wall opened. Behind the false wall were Heineken and Doderer, chained, in pajamas, in conditions police later described as medieval. They were medically intact, but exposed and freezing. They were taken to Heineken's beachfront villa in Noordwijk to recover. The kidnappers were already gone. A nationwide sweep on the same day arrested around 24 people, mostly relatives, friends, and accessories. Beillard was caught immediately. The youngest of the gang, Martin Airkamps, was caught quickly. Franz Meyer turned himself in on December 28th, nearly a month later, but Cor van Hout and Willem Holleeder, the two who had personally taken Heineken, had vanished. Now to the question I asked. The barrels buried near Zeist were eventually located after a dog walker spotted a marked banknote in the woods. About 19 million guilders came out of those barrels. House searches and other recoveries pulled in roughly another 8 million. That left approximately 8 million guilders unaccounted for. Not 7, not 15, 8, give or take, consistently across Dutch journalism for the past 40 years. In today's purchasing power, around 8 to 10 million euros, never seen by Dutch authorities again. Hold on to that number. Everything from this point forward in the story is downstream of it. Cor and Wim were already in Paris by the time the raid happened. They had crossed into France within days of Heineken's release, traveling with at least some of the cash. They rented an apartment at number 2, Rue de Pontièvre, in the 8th arrondissement, 2 blocks from the Champs-Élysées. They lived openly. They ate at restaurants. They went to clubs. They were arrested on February 29, 1984, after Dutch police tapped Sonja Holleeder's phone in Amsterdam and traced one of Cor's calls home. This is where the story becomes a story about something else entirely, because the moment they were arrested in France, the most consequential battle of the entire Heineken case began. And it had nothing to do with Heineken. It had to do with a treaty signed in 1895. The extradition treaty, in force between France and the Netherlands at the time of the arrests, dated to 1895, 89 years old. Like most extradition treaties of its era, it listed extraditable offenses one by one, a closed list. If a crime wasn't on the list, you couldn't be extradited for it. And kidnapping wasn't on the list. Neither was extortion. The only listed offense that fit what Cor and Wim had actually done was something called, in Dutch legal terminology, schriftelijke bedreiging met de dood, written threats of death. That offense carried a maximum sentence in the Netherlands of 4 years. The kidnapping itself, under modern Dutch law, would have carried 12. This is where their lawyers, Max Moskowitz Sr. on the Dutch side and Jacoba de Jong Dunan on the French side, saw the opportunity. They advised their clients to refuse to consent to extradition. The strategy was elegant. By forcing France to litigate it through the courts, they would lock the Dutch government into the 1895 treaty's narrow charge list. Cor and Wim could be extradited, yes, but only on the 4-year offense. The French Conseil d'État eventually agreed. extradition could proceed only on the lighter charge. This is the part of the story that doesn't make sense unless you understand a piece of Dutch law most people have never heard of, and I'm going to slow down here because everything else is downstream of this. Faced with the prospect of his target serving 4 years for one of the largest ransom kidnappings in European history, on December 6, 1985, Justice Minister Frits Korthals Autus did something Dutch legal scholars later called unprecedented. He withdrew the extradition request entirely. Better to have them sitting in France than to bring them home and watch them walk in 48 months. But once the request was withdrawn, France had no basis to keep them in prison. They were undocumented foreign nationals with no charges pending, so France placed them under what Dutch sources call hotel arrest. Hotel arrest. They were moved to motels around Paris and required to check in regularly. Then, in February of 1986, France tried to deport them to the Caribbean, first to Guadeloupe, then to French Saint Martin, where they could be quietly transferred onto Dutch soil at Saint Martin and rearrested by Dutch authorities. They got wind of the plan en route and refused to disembark. The journey turned into an unbelievable Caribbean odyssey. Saint Barthélemy, French Saint Martin, briefly the uninhabited islet of Tintamari, where, by the way, Peter de Vries was traveling with them, building the relationship that would produce the canonical book. Back to Guadeloupe, eventually back to mainland France. Local Caribbean populations protested against being made what they called France's drainage pit. They ended up under hotel arrest at the Ibis Hotel in Évry, south of Paris. Heineken's private security firm parked bodyguards across the street and watched them around the clock. Dutch state television filmed the bodyguards filming them. It was at the Ibis in Évry that Peter de Vries spent 4 weeks doing the interviews that became his book. In 1986, France updated its extradition framework to align with the European Convention on Extradition. The Netherlands filed a new request. Cor and Willem, exhausted by the conditions at a harsher prison they had been moved to, dropped their resistance. The new extradition was granted, except for the original 4-year offense. That charge had been excluded permanently because the original request had been withdrawn. On October 31st, 1986, they were extradited to the Netherlands. And here is where the architecture of the win locks into place. In international law, there's a doctrine called the speciality principle. It exists in virtually every modern extradition treaty. It says, in essence, that an extradited person can only be prosecuted for the specific offenses for which they were extradited, not for related offenses, not for offenses you forgot to mention, not for offenses you discover later. The speciality principle is what makes extradition treaties trustworthy. Without it, no country would ever agree to send anyone anywhere. In the Heineken case, the speciality principle bound the Netherlands forever. Cor and Willem could be prosecuted for kidnapping and for extortion, nothing else from before their extradition. No charges relating to what they did with the money, no charges for hiding it, no charges for laundering it, no charges for spending it. And here's the part that even most Dutch sources gloss over. Even if the speciality principle hadn't existed, the Dutch state still couldn't have charged them for keeping the missing 8 million. The Netherlands didn't have an independent money laundering offense in its criminal code until December 14, 2001, 18 years after the kidnapping. Before that date, you could only be prosecuted for handling stolen goods if you weren't the one who stole them. Dutch Supreme Court doctrine called this the Heller Steller Regel, the handler-thief rule. A thief cannot also be charged with handling his own stolen property. The legal explanation accompanying the 2001 reform actually cited this rule by name as the obstacle the new statute was designed to overcome. This is the double lock. By the time Dutch law had a mechanism to charge them for keeping the money, the speciality principle protected them. By the time the speciality principle could maybe have been worked around through diplomatic renegotiation, the underlying conduct was time-barred. The window in which the Dutch state could legally have taken back the 8 million guilders had never existed. I want to know what you think about this. Is the speciality principle a feature or a bug? Because it protected these men for 40 years, but it also protects every legitimate fugitive a country wants to extradite, and without it, international cooperation in criminal cases falls apart. Tell me where you land. I genuinely want to read the comments on this one. The trial in Amsterdam opened on February 19th, 1987. Cor and Willem invoked silence throughout. They didn't answer questions. They didn't appeal afterward because appealing would have risked having their sentences corrected upward to match a ceiling the Dutch Supreme Court had applied to the others in the gang. 11 years apiece, with credit for the time served in France, including the hotel arrest periods, which Dutch law didn't strictly require to be deducted, but the court did anyway. Holeeder got 12 years. Heir got 8. Heir was sentenced to 12 in absentia after escaping from a psychiatric evaluation center on New Year's Day 1985 and fleeing to Paraguay, where he lived. For over a decade, under the alias Rudy Doves, ran 2 hamburger restaurants, fathered 3 children, and attended an evangelical church 3 times a week. Peter de Vries tracked him down in 1994. Heineken's reaction when he heard was characteristic. Let him sit there. I have no feelings of revenge. I have other things on my mind. Cor and Willem were released in early January 1992. Their friend, Rob Griffhorst, threw them a release party at the Amsterdam Marriott Hotel on January 17. As they walked into the ballroom, the orchestra struck up a song. The song was Heerlijk Helder Heineken, the Heineken Brewery's own television jingle. The men who had taken Freddy Heineken at gunpoint walked into a celebration of their freedom while the brewery's commercial theme played in their honor. That moment, more than any verdict or any speech, is the moment the Heineken kidnappers won. Now we get to where the 8 million went. This part draws on the testimony of Sonia and Astrid Holleeder, given in court between 2014 and 2019, corroborated by the police statements of Thomas van der Bijl before he was murdered in 2006, and accepted as fact by the Amsterdam court in the verdict of July 4th, 2019. Cor van Hout had buried his and Willem's share of the cash in a forest near Paris before extradition. He sent Sonia a coded postcard from prison indicating the location. After their release, Thomas van der Bijl, a childhood friend of Cor's, who would later be murdered for talking to police, dug up the cash on their instructions and brought it to Rob Griffhorst, who handled the laundering. The money was channeled into the Casa Rosso, the famous sex theater on Amsterdam's Wallen, into 2 gambling halls at Molensteeg, 1 in Ouderzijds Achterburgwal, 30 in the red light district, and into roughly 12 prostitution properties on the Amsterdam in Alkmaar, a small city about 40 kilometers north of Amsterdam. Heineken, the company, not the man, quietly forbade its products from being sold in establishments tied to Holleeder and Van Hout. They knew. They couldn't prove it, but they knew. That tacit corporate acknowledgement is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the seed capital theory is correct. Holleeder, on Dutch national television in 2012, claimed the missing money had been burned on a beach. Sonia, when she eventually testified against him, called this glashard gelogen, a brazen lie. The friendship between Cor and Willem cracked in spring 1996. Cor was driving in Amsterdam with Sonia and their young son when a gunman ambushed the car. Cor was shot multiple times in the arm, the shoulder, the jaw. He survived. According to Peter de Vries's later testimony, Willem paid roughly €1 million in blackmail to the would-be assassins to call off any second attempt. From Core's perspective, that payment told him everything. Willem had ordered the hit. Willem was paying it off because Core was still alive and might find out. There was a second attempt around 2000. It also failed. Around this time, a man named Willem Enstra entered the picture. Enstra was a real estate magnate worth approximately 350 million euros at his peak. The Dutch press called him Willem the Silent because he refused to talk to journalists. He kept 12 bodyguards, drove an armored BMW, and lived in a fortified penthouse over the seaport marina. In 2002, after a rival named John Miramet survived an assassination attempt, Miramet publicly identified Enstra in the press. He said Enstra was the banker to the Underworld and Holleeder was the guardian of the bank vault. A photograph appeared in the Dutch business magazine, quote, showing Enstra and Holleeder sitting together on a park bench in front of Enstra's office. The partnership was undeniable. In late 2003 and early 2004, Enstra met 15 times with detectives from the Amsterdam Police's intelligence unit. For safety, the conversations took place inside a moving police car, which is why Dutch journalism calls them the achterbankgesprekken, the backseat conversations. Enstra named names. He described being extorted of tens of millions of euros by Holleeder. He said he expected to be killed. On Friday, January 24th, 2003, around 1:30 in the afternoon, Core van. Hout walked out of the Royal Sankong Chinese restaurant on the corner of Dorpstraat and Stationstraat in the old town center of Amstelveen, just south of Amsterdam. He had finished lunch with a boat dealer named Robert ter Haak and two others. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, two men on a stolen red BMW motorcycle drove past. The pillion passenger opened fire with an automatic weapon. Core was killed instantly. Robert ter Haak died of his wounds in the hospital weeks later. The funeral on January 31st, 2003 was a national spectacle. A white hearse drawn by 8 Frisian horses led a procession of 15 white limousines through Amsterdam. The Dutch press and the Dutch public were divided between revulsion at the glamorization of organized crime and a kind of perverse fascination with the spectacle of it. Wim Holleeder appeared at Sonja's house the night Core was killed, sat on her couch, and cried. Sonja later called them crocodile tears. He demanded the gold bearer shares Core had been holding. She realized, much later, that the shares were meant to pay the killers. Enstra was murdered on May 17, 2004, around midday, on the Apollolaan in Amsterdam Zuid. He was shot dead in front of his own office 4 months after his last backseat conversation with police, and one day after appearing on a Dutch business television program denying the laundering allegations against him. The shooter escaped on foot. 3 suspects were eventually acquitted. The book of the backseat tapes was published in 2006 and became the principal evidence triggering Holleeder's arrest for extortion in January of that year. The murder list that was eventually pinned to Holleeder includes Cor van Hout in 2003, Willem Enstra in 2004, a Dutch criminal named Kees Houtman who was shot dead in his car on his 46th birthday in front of his wife and daughter in 2005, John Miramet, who was shot dead the same day in his real estate office in Pattaya, Thailand, and Thomas van der Bijl, the man who had dug up the buried cash in the Paris woods, who was shot while vacuuming his Amsterdam cafe 3 weeks after being questioned by the prosecutor's office about the Houtman killing. After serving roughly 2/3 of a 9-year sentence for extortion, Willem Holleeder was released on January 27, 2012. And what happened next is, to me, the most morally uncomfortable chapter in this entire story. He rode a Vespa around Amsterdam. He posed for selfies with fans on beer terraces along the canals. He appeared on a Dutch television program called College Tour and told a hall full of university students that he regretted the kidnapping and that Heineken had been a strongman. He wrote a weekly column for a Dutch magazine called Nieuwe Revue. He recorded a rap single with a Dutch artist called Lange Frans titled Willem is terug. Willem is back. He co-founded a motorcycle club. The Dutch press came up with a name for him, de knuffel crimineel, the huggable criminal. And honestly, this is the part that doesn't sit right with me. Not the kidnapping, not even the murders, the Vespa, the column, the selfies. A country looked at a man widely known to have ordered 5 killings, including the killing of the best friend whose sister he was about to deceive again, and decided to call him huggable. What does it tell you about the Netherlands in 2012 that this happened? What does it tell you about how a society metabolizes its own organized crime? Tell me what you think. I'm not asking rhetorically. After Cora's killing, his sisters Astrid and Sonia Holleeder became convinced their brother had ordered the murder. They were also convinced he might kill Sonia next. Astrid was a trained criminal defense lawyer. She knew the system from the inside. Around 2013, she and Sonia began cooperating with the prosecutor's office. Astrid started recording her brother. For 5 years, she carried hidden audio equipment into prison visits and family meetings and recorded everything he said. Hundreds of hours. She and Sonia didn't enter full witness protection because that would have severed their family ties entirely. Instead, they entered a Dutch protective program that allowed limited family contact. Astrid moved more than 30 times in a decade. Sonia's children grew up under guard. The trial opened on February 5th, 2018, at a high-security courthouse in Amsterdam, Osdorp, called De Bunker. The case file ran to roughly 500,000 pages. Public interest was so intense that Dutch news described tickets to the courtroom as the hottest tickets in Amsterdam. Fans queued overnight to glimpse Holleeder through bulletproof glass. The prosecutor, Sabine Tams, opened with a line that defined the entire proceeding. She said there was nothing cuddly about the matters before the court, and that the time had come to demythologize the accused. The man on trial, she said, was not a master criminal or a cuddly criminal, but a cold, everyday kidnapper and killer. Astrid testified, often through an audio link from an undisclosed location. Her line that has now become something like a fixed point in Dutch legal memory was about the dog. If you have a friendly dog that bites children, she said, you take the children's side and have it put down. Sonia was calmer and somehow more devastating. She called him a psychopath. She said the family had to flip a coin for who he would shoot first. On Thursday, July 4th, 2019, the court delivered the verdict. Life imprisonment, the maximum sentence under Dutch law for ordering 5 murders, the manslaughter of Robert ter Haak, the attempted murder of Myriam, the wounding of an Instra associate, and leading a criminal organization. The presiding judge said Holleeder had been merciless and indifferent in his belief that he had the power of life and death. The appeal was upheld in June 2022. The Dutch Supreme Court rejected the final cassation appeal on January 9th, 2024. The conviction is now permanent. He's currently held at the high-security Hout prison facility in the southern Netherlands. The same wing holds Ridouan Taghi, the boss of the Macro Mafia, who received life imprisonment in February 2024. In September 2024, a brief 20-second contact between Holleeder and Taghi through a glass partition triggered a parliamentary uproar in The Hague. Holleeder is 67 now. He has serious heart problems. He has applied repeatedly for transfer out of the high security wing. As of mid-2026, the prosecutor's office is reportedly struggling to provide updated threat information that would justify keeping him there. If you're still with me on this one, if you sat through the speciality principle and the backseat conversations and the dog that bites children line and didn't bounce, a subscribe genuinely means a lot. This is the kind of story that takes weeks to research and most channels won't touch because it doesn't end clean. If you want more like it, I'll keep making them. There's one more thing I have to tell you. It's the part that makes everything I just told you mean something different. The macro mafia, the criminal organization Ridwan Taghi built, the one currently considered the most violent organized crime threat in the Netherlands, did not appear out of nowhere. Multiple Dutch organized crime researchers and the Wikipedia article on the Moroccan mafia trace its origins to the 1980s when established Dutch criminal networks of the era, networks dominated by Holleeder, Van Hout, Sam Klepper, and John Miramet, drew Moroccan Dutch youth into the hard drug business. The capital that funded those networks in the 1990s came in significant part from the Heineken ransom. The networks became templates. The templates became the macro mafia. In 2017, a journalist named Peter de Vries, the same journalist who had spent 4 weeks in a Paris hotel interviewing Cor and Wim in 1986, the same journalist who had tracked Franz Meyer down in Paraguay in 1994, the same journalist who had been confidant to Thomas van der Bijl before van der Bijl was murdered, the same journalist who had advised Astrid Holleeder on her recordings, became an advisor to the key state witness in the Marengo trial against Taghi. On July 6, 2021, Peter de Vries left the studios of a Dutch evening television show called RTL Boulevard. As he walked down Lange Leidseedwaarstraat in central Amsterdam toward his car, a gunman shot him in the head at close range. He died 9 days later on July 15, 2021. The shooter and his driver have been sentenced to 28 years each. The man who told this story died because of the world this story created. King Willem Alexander called the killing an attack on the Dutch rule of law. The president of the Dutch Police Union said the country undoubtedly had the characteristics of a narco-state. So, here we are. Holleeder is 67 and sick, sitting in a high-security cell next to the man who built the empire that grew out of his own. Astrid Holleeder, after 10 years in hiding, stepped out of the shadows on August 27, 2025, and announced she was reclaiming her face and her name. She was named chair of the jury for the 2026 Golden Strop, the Netherlands' top thriller fiction prize. The award ceremony was held in Utrecht in May. The 8 million guilders is not coming back. The speciality principle is still on the books in The Hague, exactly as it was in 1986. The Achterbankersprechen transcripts are still in print. The Casa Rosso still operates on the Valen. The Amsterdam properties in Alkmaar are still there. Most of them have been sold and resold so many times that the original chain of ownership is permanently obscured. And somewhere in a forensic archive, there's an audio recording from the night of November 28, 1983. A helicopter circling over a viaduct near Utrecht. A camera locked on an empty landscape. A voice on the cabin intercom saying, loud and clear, "We've lost them." The Dutch state recovered Heineken. It convicted the kidnappers. It eventually convicted the boss of the entire post-Heineken Dutch underworld for the murders he ordered. None of those things were nothing, but the question of whether the state ever really won, whether any of this was ever really resolved, has a different answer. Astrid Holleeder said it to her brother in court in the closest thing to a final word this story has produced. "I give you life. she said. But I therefore also have life imprisonment. The state took back Wim Holleeder's freedom. It did not take back his win.